Most people think control looks obvious. Someone gives the order, someone else follows it. Simple. But the most dangerous form of control never looks like control at all. 𝐋𝐞𝐵 Machiavelli understood something most people still miss today. The moment someone feels controlled, they resist. Pride activates, ego pushes back, and influence disappears. So the smartest manipulators never give orders. They guide decisions. They shape situations. They make people believe the idea was theirs from the beginning. In this video, you will uncover 10 ruthless Machiavellian rules of reverse psychology, dark psychological tactics that allow you to control outcomes without asking, influence behavior without pressure, and make people walk exactly where you want, while believing they chose the path themselves. Once you understand these rules, you'll start noticing how often decisions aren't really decisions at all. The reverse trigger. Most people believe control comes from giving orders. 𝐋𝐞𝐵 Machiavelli understood something far more dangerous. The most effective control happens when people believe the decision was never forced on them in the first place. This is where reverse psychology begins. Human beings naturally resist control. The moment someone feels pushed, instructed, or commanded, their instinct is to push back. Even when the instruction is reasonable, the mind reacts as if its freedom is under threat. And the more direct the pressure becomes, the stronger that resistance grows. Reverse psychology exploits this exact reaction. Instead of pushing someone toward an action, you move in the opposite direction. You subtly suggest the behavior may not be necessary, important, or even suitable for them. The psychological tension instantly changes. Now the person is not reacting against pressure. Instead, their mind begins defending the very action you wanted in the first place. 𝐋𝐞𝐵 Machiavelli often observed that power works best when it moves through human nature rather than against it. When people feel their independence is protected, they become easier to guide. The reverse trigger uses that principle precisely. When someone believes a decision was their own discovery rather than your demand, their commitment becomes stronger. They defend it and justify it without realizing the idea was planted. This tactic appears in everyday situations. Tell someone they probably would not enjoy something, and curiosity increases. Suggest that a goal might be too difficult, and pride pushes them to prove the opposite. What looks like stubborn independence is often a guided reaction. That is why the reverse trigger is powerful. It does not fight human ego. It uses it. Once people believe they are acting freely, they rarely question the path they chose. The illusion of choice. One of the simplest ways to control a decision is to never appear as if you are controlling it. Direct orders create resistance. People guard their autonomy instinctively. The moment someone feels cornered, their mind begins searching for ways to reject the pressure, even when the suggestion itself is reasonable. 𝐋𝐞𝐵 Machiavelli understood that influence rarely works through force alone. The strongest control appears when a person believes they are acting freely. This is where the illusion of choice becomes powerful. Instead of pushing someone toward a single outcome, you present two options. On the surface, both look legitimate. Both appear like independent decisions. But the structure of the choice quietly removes every path except the one you intended. The person feels respected because they were allowed to decide. Their ego remains intact because no command was given. Yet the direction of their behavior was already shaped before the question was asked. The mind rarely questions a decision it believes it helped create. 𝐋𝐞𝐵 Machiavelli often explained that rulers maintained control by guiding circumstances rather than confronting people directly. When the environment limits the possible outcomes, individuals begin choosing within that environment without recognizing the boundaries were designed. The illusion of choice follows the same principle. Imagine a situation where someone must complete a task. If you command them directly, they may resist. But if you ask whether they prefer to handle it now or later in the evening, the structure of the decision already assumes the task will happen. The debate shifts away from whether it will happen. The only question left becomes when. As long as people believe their freedom was respected, they rarely examine how the options were constructed. And that is why the illusion of choice is such a quiet form of control. No argument, no pressure, just a decision someone believes they made entirely on their own. If you're starting to see how this game really works, comment "I see the game" below and subscribe. The next rule is even more ruthless. Strategic resistance. Most people try to persuade others through agreement. They support the idea, reinforce the plan, and show they are on the same side. On the surface, this seems logical. Agreement should create cooperation. But in many situations, it does the opposite. When someone senses immediate agreement, the idea stops feeling like their own. It begins to feel like a proposal that must be evaluated or challenged. Niccolò Machiavelli understood that influence often grows stronger through tension rather than harmony. When resistance appears at the right moment, it activates something powerful in the human mind: defensiveness. Strategic resistance uses this instinct deliberately. Instead of supporting someone's idea immediately, you introduce mild opposition. Not aggressive disagreement, but enough friction to trigger their need to defend their position. The moment someone begins defending an idea, their psychological investment increases. They search for stronger arguments, explain their reasoning more passionately, and reinforce the logic behind it. With every explanation, the idea becomes more deeply rooted in their mind. Ironically, your resistance strengthens their commitment. This dynamic appears frequently in negotiation and leadership. If someone presents a plan and you immediately praise it, their enthusiasm may stay moderate. But if you question a small part of it, determination appears. The person begins proving why the idea deserves to succeed. Niccolò Machiavelli often emphasized that human pride is easy to guide. People defend what they feel responsible for creating. The more they explain their reasoning, the more ownership they feel over the outcome. Strategic resistance turns that instinct into leverage. What began as a simple suggestion evolves into a position they strongly protect. From the outside, it appears they persuaded you. In reality, your resistance activated the very commitment that now drives them forward. Ego manipulation. Direct control often fails because it threatens a person's pride. When people feel ordered, corrected, or dominated, their ego reacts immediately. Even a reasonable request can trigger resistance if it makes someone feel smaller or less important. Niccolò Machiavelli understood that ego is not an obstacle to control. It is one of the most effective tools for achieving it. Instead of confronting a person's pride, you align with it. You allow their self-image to become the force guiding their behavior. Once someone believes an action protects or elevates their status, they begin moving in that direction voluntarily. This is the foundation of ego manipulation. Rather than telling someone what to do, you frame the situation so the action appears consistent with who they believe they are. A person who sees themselves as intelligent wants to make intelligent decisions. Someone who sees themselves as capable wants to prove that capability. The moment their identity becomes connected to a decision, the need to maintain that identity begins pushing them forward. Niccolò Machiavelli often noted that people will endure difficulty, risk, and effort if the outcome confirms their importance. Pride can motivate behavior more reliably than pressure ever could. Ego manipulation works by turning that pride into leverage. Instead of presenting an order, you present an opportunity for someone to demonstrate the qualities they value about themselves. You position the action as proof of their intelligence, strength, or competence. Once that link forms, the person begins defending the decision internally. They believe the choice reflects their character. From the outside, it appears that they acted independently. But the deeper dynamic is different. Their ego guided the behavior. And when pride becomes attached to a decision, people rarely step away from it. They move forward with conviction, protecting the very image they believe they are proving. Controlled scarcity. People rarely chase what is always available. When something is constantly present, constantly offered, and constantly accessible, the mind stops treating it as valuable. Familiarity reduces urgency. Attention fades. because there is no risk of losing it. Niccolò Machiavelli understood this principle long before modern psychology explained it. Value grows in the presence of scarcity. Controlled scarcity uses this instinct deliberately. Instead of making your attention, approval, or presence permanently available, you regulate it. You appear engaged at certain moments, then unavailable at others. This pattern quietly changes the psychological balance. When something becomes slightly harder to access, the mind begins assigning it greater importance. Curiosity increases. Attention sharpens. People start noticing the moments when your presence appears and the moments when it disappears. The absence creates pressure, not through confrontation, but through uncertainty. Niccolò Machiavelli often wrote that power is strengthened when others begin adjusting their behavior in response to your movements. Scarcity encourages exactly that reaction. When your time, attention, or approval becomes limited, people begin working harder to secure it. They try to hold your interest. They try to earn your validation. This shift happens because the human mind treats rare resources differently from common ones. Scarcity signals value, and value attracts effort. Controlled scarcity does not mean constant distance or cold detachment. It means avoiding predictable availability. When every interaction becomes guaranteed, there is no psychological tension. But when your presence appears selective, people start paying closer attention to it. They begin measuring their behavior against the possibility of gaining or losing that access. From the outside, nothing dramatic appears to change. Yet the dynamic slowly moves in your favor. Because once someone begins pursuing your attention instead of expecting it, the balance of influence quietly shifts. And that shift is where controlled scarcity becomes powerful. The silence pressure. Most people believe influence comes from speaking more, explaining your point, defending your position, filling every pause with another argument. The assumption is simple. The more you say, the stronger your influence becomes. Niccolò Machiavelli understood the opposite can be true. Silence often creates more pressure than words ever could. When a conversation becomes tense, people instinctively try to remove the discomfort. They talk faster, explain more, and reveal details simply to break the silence hanging in the room. That reaction creates an opening. Silence pressure works by allowing the other person's mind to fill the space you leave behind. When you stop arguing and remain calm, the psychological tension shifts entirely onto them. They begin searching for clarity. They begin explaining themselves. And the more they speak, the more information they reveal. Niccolò Machiavelli often emphasized that observation gives a strategist more power than confrontation. A person who speaks constantly exposes their position, their reasoning, and their weaknesses. A person who remains quiet gathers all of that information without revealing anything in return. Silence creates imbalance. The person speaking becomes increasingly aware of the empty space in front of them. That awareness pushes them to continue talking, sometimes offering explanations they never intended to share. Over time, their words begin doing your work for you. They clarify their motives. They justify their decisions. They attempt to persuade you, even when you never asked for persuasion. What appears to be patience is actually strategic pressure, because silence does something subtle to the human mind. It makes people uncomfortable with uncertainty. And when people feel that uncertainty, they rush to resolve it. In that moment, control shifts quietly, not through argument, not through force, but through restraint. And the person who reveals the least often understands the most. Expectation reversal. Human behavior is built on prediction. People constantly try to anticipate what others will do next. They study patterns, tone, reactions, and habits so they can feel prepared for the outcome of an interaction. Once they believe they understand your pattern, their guard relaxes. Niccolò Machiavelli understood that predictability weakens influence. When people believe they can read you, they begin controlling the rhythm of the interaction. They prepare responses before you even speak. They shape their behavior around what they expect from you. Expectation reversal breaks that advantage. Instead of following the reaction someone anticipates, You respond in a completely different direction, not randomly, but deliberately. When a person expects anger, you remain calm. When they expect agreement, you pause or question the idea. The sudden shift interrupts their mental preparation. For a moment, their mind has nothing ready. That brief confusion creates psychological space where influence becomes easier. People rely on expectations to maintain confidence in social situations. When those expectations collapse, their certainty weakens. Niccolò Machiavelli often noted that uncertainty is a powerful strategic condition. A person who cannot predict your reactions must constantly reassess their own behavior. They begin watching you more carefully. They hesitate before speaking. They reconsider assumptions they previously felt confident about. Expectation reversal creates this uncertainty by breaking the pattern people thought they understood. The goal is not chaos, but controlled unpredictability. When your reactions cannot be easily mapped, others lose the advantage of preparation. And once someone stops feeling certain about how you will respond, their position becomes less stable. They begin adapting to you instead of anticipating you. That shift quietly moves the balance of influence, because the person who controls the pattern of reactions often controls the direction of the interaction itself. The commitment trap. People rarely change direction after they have publicly committed to something. Once a person states a position, makes a promise, or agrees to a small step, the mind begins protecting that decision. Not because the decision was perfect, but because consistency feels safer than admitting a mistake. Niccolò Machiavelli understood that control rarely comes from forcing large decisions. It begins with small ones. The commitment trap works by guiding someone into making a minor agreement first. A small step that feels harmless, reasonable, and easy to accept. At this stage, there is little resistance because the request appears insignificant. But that small agreement quietly changes the psychological landscape. Once a person says yes to the first step, their identity becomes connected to that choice. The mind prefers consistency between past actions and future behavior. Rejecting the next step would force them to admit the previous decision may have been wrong. Most people avoid that discomfort. Instead, they continue moving forward. Niccolò Machiavelli often described how influence grows through gradual positioning. Each decision builds upon the previous one, making the next step appear natural rather than forced. This is how the commitment trap unfolds. A small agreement leads to a slightly larger one. That agreement leads to another step that feels like a logical continuation. The person believes they are simply following their own decisions. In reality, the path was structured from the beginning. What makes this tactic powerful is that it never appears manipulative. Each request seems reasonable on its own. Each step feels voluntary. But together, those steps form a direction. And by the time someone realizes how far they have moved, turning back feels more difficult than continuing forward. Because once commitment begins shaping identity, people protect their choices more fiercely than they question them. Social positioning. People rarely follow instructions. They follow perception. Niccolò Machiavelli understood that influence does not always come from arguments or authority. Much of human behavior is shaped by how others appear within a social environment. Status changes decisions. When someone is perceived as respected, capable, or influential, their suggestions carry more weight. The same idea spoken by a person with little social presence may be ignored, but spoken by someone with visible standing, it suddenly feels more credible. This is the principle behind social positioning. Instead of trying to control people directly, you position yourself in a way that naturally increases the value of your opinion. The environment begins doing the persuasion for you. Humans constantly scan social cues. They observe who receives attention, whose ideas are acknowledged, and who others seem to respect. These signals quietly influence how seriously someone is taken. Niccolò Machiavelli often advised rulers to manage appearances carefully, because reputation shapes obedience long before orders are given. Social positioning works through that same mechanism. When people believe you hold influence, They begin adjusting their behavior accordingly. They listen more carefully. They question you less. They become more open to your suggestions, because ignoring someone perceived as important carries social risk. The dynamic changes without confrontation. Instead of pushing people toward decisions, your position encourages them to move in that direction themselves. Over time, this influence becomes self-reinforcing. The more people respond to your presence with attention or respect, the stronger that perception becomes. Others begin treating you the same way, simply because the pattern already exists. This is why Niccolò Machiavelli considered reputation one of the most powerful tools of control. Because once your position is established in the minds of others, influence begins happening before you even speak. The invisible hand. The highest form of control is the one no one notices. When people feel forced, they resist. When they feel manipulated, they pull away. But when they believe a decision came entirely from their own thinking, they defend it with surprising intensity. Niccolò Machiavelli understood that the strongest influence leaves no visible fingerprints. This is the principle behind the invisible hand. Instead of directing someone openly, you shape the environment around the decision. You introduce ideas gradually, frame situations carefully, and allow the other person to connect the conclusions themselves. The moment they believe the idea was their own discovery, the psychological dynamic changes. People protect what they think they created. They justify the decision internally. They defend it in conversation. They invest more energy into making it succeed because their identity has now become attached to the outcome. And once that identity connection forms, reversing the decision becomes difficult. Niccolò Machiavelli often described how powerful leaders guided events indirectly. Instead of commanding every action, they structured circumstances so that others moved in the direction already planned. From the outside, it appeared natural, but the path had been shaped long before the decision was made. The invisible hand works in the same way. You influence timing. You influence context. You influence what information appears important. Gradually, the person begins forming a conclusion that aligns with the direction you intended. When they finally announce the decision, they feel confident in it. They believe they reasoned their way there independently. And because they believe the choice was always theirs, they rarely question the forces that guided them. That is why invisible influence is so effective. Control becomes strongest when it feels like freedom. What makes reverse psychology so powerful is that it rarely looks like control while it's happening. No commands, no pressure, no obvious manipulation. And yet, decisions begin moving in a direction that feels completely voluntary to the person making them. That is the deeper lesson behind these Machiavellian rules. The strongest influence does not come from forcing outcomes. It comes from understanding how the human mind protects ego, values independence, and defends its own choices. When you learn how those instincts work, control stops looking like authority. It starts looking like freedom. If you found these rules useful, like the video, subscribe for more dark psychology and Machiavellian strategy, and comment power below if you're starting to recognize how these psychological games actually operate. Because once you understand how influence really works, you stop asking for control and start creating it.